Hello, everyone, and welcome to From Kimono to Street Style, the global story of Japanese fashion, our current Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us. I am Jenna Lindeke Heavenrich, a research fellow and the director of the Pacific Connect series here at YCAPS. I'm stepping in today for our usual host and program director of this series, Amani Kidd, who is behind the scenes today. Today we are joined by Dr. Toby Slade, who will be presenting From Kimono to Street Style, the global story of Japanese fashion. Dr. Toby Slade is a fashion historian and associate professor at the University of Technology in Sydney. He lived in Japan for 17 years and has taught and conducted research at institutions including the University of Tokyo and Bunka Gakuen University. His work focuses on Japanese fashion, luxury culture, and the relationship between clothing, history, and society. Dr. Slade is the author of Japanese Fashion, A Cultural History, and regularly lectures on internationally on fashion, design, and Japanese culture. And before we begin, just a kind reminder to everyone to refrain from turning on your microphone during the duration of today's recording and presentation. So, without further ado, Toby, please.
Thank you very much, Jenna and Amani in the background. I did just want to add that my very first job in Japan was actually at the National Defense Academy in Yokosuka, where I taught for a year in 2006, I think it was. Anyway, today I want to talk about the whole suite of Japanese fashion history, starting with the development of the kimono to the sort of crazier street styles that we see today. The sort of sweep of history that I am going to attempt to summarize in about half an hour today, I want to really start in the Muromachi period, the Ashikaga shogunate and the Warring States period, where Japanese culture really starts to split off from Chinese culture and really develop a lot of the key aesthetics that we now think of as quintessentially Japanese. I'll talk a little bit about the Edo period, that long 250 years of isolation, and then those fabulous periods of modernity, the Meiji era, the Taishō era, and into the Showa and right up to the present. I always like to start with this comparison. It comes from historian Donald Keene, who talks about two shoguns of the Ashikaga shogunate, Yoshimitsu, the grandfather, and Yoshimatsu, the grandson. Yoshimitsu built the Golden Temple in Kyoto. If you've been to Kyoto, these are two of the temples you've most probably seen. The Golden Temple is perhaps the most famous. It's gorgeous and showy, and is displaying his wealth and power. As a politician, he reopened trade with China. He ended an imperial schism. He was really a great politician, and he unified the country to a certain extent. But his grandson, a little bit later, let it all fall apart and allowed the country to fall into civil war for almost 100 years. But although he was a terrible politician, he devoted himself to aesthetics and the art. He was very important in the development of the tea ceremony and associated arts like ikebana, flower arrangement, and he patronized Noh theatre. And it's really a lot of these much more subtle aesthetics, doing sort of more with less, and sort of things like wabi-sabi that we really associate with Japanese aesthetics today. They were sort of developed around his time. So I always like to start with that contrast, and Donald Keene's quote is that these aesthetic choices may have indicated a man who earlier exhausted the pleasures of extravagance and had at last achieved some sort of enlightenment. So it's really a move away from showy Chinese-based aesthetics towards something more subtle, something more indigenously Japanese. The textile equivalent of what's happening in this period and a little bit later is a move away from the shuttle-woven brocades, often with gold and silver kinran, towards fabrics like yuzen. Yuzen is simple fabrics, but using a rice paste method, is able to create these incredibly intricate designs without sort of the expense of gold and silver. So sort of through Japanese ingenuity, you start to have a whole new aesthetic, sort of based on necessity. These are just a couple of examples of the amazing things that can be done with yuzen dyeing. It's an overrobe, um, and here, this is late 17th century, but you can see on that kimono, you can see elements of shibori as well, the little tie-dye. Kimono, of course, now we think of it as a very particular garment, but kimono comes from kirumono, things to wear. So it basically meant all clothing at one point. And traditionally you called the kosore, the short sleeve kimono, and the furisore, the long sleeve kimono. The furisore, of course, is supposed to be worn by young girls. The swinging sleeves have become sort of a metaphor for youth. You can see in this picture by Harunobu on the left here, the young woman with the big long sleeves picking the blossoms, and maybe older married sister or her maid or something has the short sleeve kimono in that image. Most of samurai clothing was made of silk. And samurai, however, were only 10% of the population throughout the Edo period. And everyone else would have worn hemps or worsted fabrics. Cotton slowly increased in use throughout the Edo period. But most of kimono history would have actually been a lot scratchier and a lot sort of rougher than we see today. In the Meiji period, they talk about women starting to look soft from a distance. And that's because in the Meiji period, in the modern period, when the feudal class arrangements are abolished, everyone can wear silk and everyone wants to. There's sort of a great samuraization of fashion because everyone wants to adopt the fashions and particularly the fabric, the silk, that had been reserved just for the samurai. I'm showing you here a couple of examples of how kimono was never a static clothing system. It was always dynamic, and there are always fashions that existed in different periods. You can see here in the Momoyama period, body panels were twice the width of the sleeve panels, so they hung very loosely around the body. I can show you here an enormous obi, the belt in the middle. Obis were, of course, an area of a lot of fashion. This is the actor Riko tying her obi. And here, again, a Harunobu picture where you can see an enormous bow at the back of the kimono there. If you were a courtesan, courtesans were sort of exempt from a lot of the social rules. And in the pleasure quarters, in the floating world, they were sort of considered to have a bit of artistic license. And they definitely had this with their fashions. You can see here, they're even, rakishly tying their obis at the front. As obis became wider over time, you start to see a real fashion for bifurcated designs. That is, leaving the blank area in the middle of the kimono and putting all the interesting design around the edges, because the middle period, the middle area is going to be taken up by the obi. So you really start throughout the Edo period to see this bifurcated design. Here's another. This is a summer kimono, but again, you can see the design of crickets and grasshoppers and cricket cages. It's all at the edges, nothing in the middle to where the obi will be. Before the Edo period, there was this strange moment. If you've just seen that fabulous TV show Shogun, that dramatizes this period, the end of the Warring States period and the beginning of the Edo period, there was a period when Japan was actually engaging with the rest of the world. And I love this as an image of what hybrid fashions could have possibly been. This is Hasekura Tsunenaga. He was the Japanese ambassador to Spain and the Vatican from 1613 to 1620. And you can see in his outfit, he's obviously wearing kimono, but there's little lace collars and there's lace cuffs, and he's got samurai swords, but other elements look like they could be right out of sort of European Vatican styles. So it was a possible moment for hybridity. This is another example from that period. This is a surcoat from the 16th century in a sort of more Portuguese and Spanish style. And this is an incredible garment. This still exists in Kyodaiji Temple in Kyoto. This is another surcoat, jimbauri, that's worn over your armor, but this one has actually been made with a Persian carpet. So a Persian carpet was obviously imported into Japan. They didn't know what to do with it, didn't think it was right to put it on the floor, and they made this amazing garment from it. But the Edo period, of course, went a different direction. In the Edo period, two crucial policies defined and really made Japanese culture. The Sankin Kotai policy, that's the alternate attendant policy. Like the Palace of Versailles in France, every Japanese noble had to spend a certain amount of the year in Edo, in the capital. So it's requiring anyone who's anyone in Japan to live in the same city. And if they aren't actually there, if they go back to their domain, they had to leave members of their family in Edo. So really what this does is, in the same way as Louis XIV in France, aristocrats stop competing with violence and they start competing with fashion, because they're all in the same city, they all want to show off to each other, and they're also traveling through each other's domains to get to and from Edo. So it really becomes the policy that maintains peace and prosperity, but also builds a real fashion culture in Edo. The other policy, of course, is the Sakoku policy, the isolation policy that says, no foreigners come in, no Japanese can go out, but except for the limited trade through Dejima in Nagasaki. These two policies were actually so successful in unifying Japan and in stopping the warring state period, that it had the unintended consequence of making the merchants very rich. This is, you might think this is a good thing, but it was a bad thing for the samurai because their wealth was based on rice and rice taxation. But merchants' wealth was based on trade, and that was expanding sort of exponentially through the Edo period because of the peace and prosperity. But the samurai's wealth was staying pretty static. And you can see here the population of Edo is also growing, becomes the biggest city in the world by 1750. So the samurai try to make all these laws to prevent the merchants from being fancier than them. There's sort of all these sumptuary regulations about their clothes. There's a little list there on the slide, but it really is a point where the samurai are trying to regulate their grandeur, even though they can't afford it anymore. This is just a little picture of Dejima in Nagasaki that you might have visited. Of course, Japan was still a little bit porous, and interesting things were entering Japan, a lot of sort of medical knowledge, of course, but also things like Prussian blue, a synthetic dye synthesized in Germany that would have been traded through China by the Dutch East India Company and then entered into Japan and is present, of course, in perhaps the most famous artwork of the Edo period, Hokusai's The Great Wave off Kanagawa. It's actually a Prussian blue, so a foreign blue, even in the middle of the isolation period. During this Edo period, there was an explosion of fashion culture. And they said fashions have changed from those in the past and have become increasingly ostentatious. In everything, people have a liking for finery above their station. Women's clothes go to extremes. Because they forget their proper place, extravagant women should be in fear of divine punishment. Even the robes of some awesome high-ranking families used to be nothing finer than Kyoto habutai, plain silk. Black clothing with 5 crests could not be called inappropriate for anyone from daimyo down to commoner. But in recent years, certain shrewd Kyoto people have started to lavish every manner of extravagance on men's and women's clothing and put out design books in color. This was sort of the moral outrage in 1688. So what were these design books? This is a really interesting element of the Edo period. They were first published around 1666, and about 180 have been published between then and about 1820. And they were sort of an integrated manual of the fashion system between Kyoto and Edo and Osaka. And they served as both fashion plates as well as sort of customer catalogs. And these are really interesting because Japan is doing this at least 100, 200 years before the French start to. So you can really say the birth of the fashion magazine is Japanese rather than European. This is an example of how it would have been used. You can see in this image, the young girl is looking at a print. The salesperson is showing her a bolt of silk. Her friend or her maid, perhaps her mother, is looking at another bolt of silk. And what's really interesting about this particular image, you'll see the logo on the little case that he's got with him. That's a logo that's still, this is from 1772, but that's a logo that's still in use today because that is the logo of Mitsukoshi. The Ichigoya Kimono shop became the Mitsukoshi department store. These pattern books started to be put out in color, and you can see the amazing designs that you'd have been able to choose from. And then another very, very interesting development, these books start to show women dressed in the clothes that they're selling. It seems so obvious and usual for us, but this was a real innovation. You're starting to have models, and you can see here, these are models that are trying to represent the type of girl that you want to be. The one at the top there was called palace style, glamorous style for a samurai woman. Mansion style, a little bit more subdued, a little bit more middle class perhaps. Bathhouse maiden style, if you were sort of young and sexy, that might be the style you were going to go for. And the last one there was called castle toppler style. Castle toppler was a euphemism in Japan for a woman that is so expensive to maintain that your castle falls over from lack of maintenance. So obviously, if you aspire to be that type of a woman, that was the style you should go for. This is another really interesting element that you see in prints throughout the Edo period. This is actually the same performer that I showed you before, Roko. Roko was an onagata, that is a man that performed as a woman, like a drag queen. So, it wasn't this generation that invented all this. Roko was so successful as a performer that she was even able to trademark a color. So Roko cha was for brown, sort of like a tea color, cha, brown. And so almost like Tiffany's, she was able to have a color associated with her as a famous performer. And then that color was then sold in kimono shops based on her fame. So product placement, even in 1758, 1759 in Japan. There was a three-way sort of alliance going on between the publishing industry that were producing these books and these prints, the fashion industry that was selling the fabrics and the kimono, and the water trade, of course, which is brothels and tea houses and all the shades of prostitution in Japan that is also in all of these prints selling the girl or the house that the girl is from. Courtesans were respected in Japanese society, looked up on as fashion leaders. And part of the reason, as I said before, was because they were exempt from sumptuary regulation. And in this sort of separate floating world, they were allowed this sort of artistic license. This is quintessential sort of image. Here, the kimono is for sale, the girl is for sale, and also in the same image, the image, of course, is for sale. You can buy the print, but in the same image again, this is the Matsuzakiya department store logo in the background as well. Another sort of fashion item, this isn't quite kimono, but something that became incredibly popular throughout the Edo period was tortoiseshell hair combs and hair ornaments. And once you sort of notice them, you see them everywhere in images from the Edo period. They were made from tortoiseshell. So again, a globalized commodity. Tortoiseshell was actually or came from Sri Lanka. Hornbill turtles would come up on the beach, and actually what they would do is they would light a fire. They'd flip the turtle over. This sounds horrific. They'd flip the turtle over and heat up the shell and then peel off some of the shell. But the turtle would survive and would come back to the same beach the next year to lay its eggs again, and they would do the same thing because the shell had grown back. So it was almost like, well, sort of more horrific form of shearing a sheep or something like that. But this tortoise shell was then taken to Japan by the Dutch East India Company and fashioned into these amazing combs and hair ornaments. This picture I'm showing you on the right is a courtesan called Takao II. Courtesans' names, like a lot of famous artists and kabuki actors, etc., were inherited. So she was the second Takao at the house. That would have been passed down from a courtesan above her. And she, as the apprentice, would have learned from Takao I. She was a courtesan of the Yoshiwara in Edo. She debuted in 1655. She became the leading courtesan of the great Miura house, prestigious Yoshiwara brothel. And as you can see, she's wearing 3 combs, 8 kanzashi, the long pins, and a kogai, that's the big piece at the back of tortoiseshell. So she was obviously very rich. These were very expensive. She was famous for having an affair with one of the daimyo of the Date clan in the north, and there was even a kabuki play written about her. The sad thing about her, of course, though, if you look at the dates, 1640 to 1659, she debuted in 1655. So she debuted as a courtesan when she was 15 and became one of the most famous in the Yoshiwara, but she was dead by the time she was 19. Just a little bit more on tortoiseshell combs. A comb cost about 2 ryo. A ryo was supposed to be a gold coin, but it was enough to buy enough rice for one person for a whole year. So if a comb was worth 2 of those, it's like all your food for 2 years. Showing you here a few more images of the fashions of tortoiseshell combs throughout the Edo period. And here again in Nagasaki. All this isolation eventually had to end, of course, in the Meiji period, which sort of started in 1868 after Perry came in 1852. Japan was eventually forced to modernize. Japan didn't really know what to modernize, and they sent missions around the world to try and work out what they needed to do to prevent them from being colonized. At the same time, they also discovered a whole lot of things that were very important for their fashion industry. In the Vienna Exposition in 1873, European fabrics, chemical dyes, jacquard looms, flying shuttles, graph paper, all start to change Japanese fashion. This is a picture. This is 1874. So only 6 years into the Meiji Restoration, and this is a picture in Ginza. A brick town has sprung up in the middle of Tokyo, and you can see all sorts of coaches and different fashions starting to appear very, very quickly. Unlike a lot of other monarchies, the Japanese monarchy wanted to lead the way. One wanted to show and wanted to lead the fashion into modernity. And so this is an example here of the Empress Meiji, who was famous for stopping the custom of blackening her teeth. It was married women were supposed to blacken their teeth. It was thought to be more beautiful if when you smiled, you didn't show any sort of white teeth. And so with a mixture of iron filings and strong tea, women would blacken their teeth. Foreigners, of course, thought this was disgusting. And so very quickly, through the Empress's example, the custom died out in the early Meiji period. Japan was already sort of ready for a fashion revolution in the Meiji period. They'd already been through what some historians call an industrious revolution, that the fashion that had already grown up in the Edo period had meant the utility of money, that all the stuff you could buy with money had created a work ethic amongst Japanese people because they wanted to, have a side hustle or two to get a bit of extra money to buy a little bit more clothing. And so they'd already had this instilling of a work ethic through this industrious revolution. And so they were very much ready for the industrial revolution when it came. I'm showing you here the silk reeling machines. Japan became the biggest producer of silk by the early 20th century. Just want to skip forward a little bit. This is a little bit more about kimono and its modernization through the Meiji period. But I did sort of want to get to more contemporary fashions, the Emperor Meiji, the Rokomeikon period. Into the Taishō period, this is when women really start to modernize beyond simply hairstyles, and you see this character of the modern girl start to appear in Japanese popular culture. Japan had become very wealthy during the First World War when Europe and America had turned their industry to armaments, and Japanese industry had been able to grow and fill some of the gap in other industries. And so, like elsewhere in the world, there was this flapper age, sort of a roaring 20s. And here you see, this is an article in Shiseido Graph where they've even sort of used the English word modern girl. And interestingly, what this article says from 1926, and this is, I think, really telling about Japanese fashion in general. It says, you can get the look of a modern girl, but you don't actually have to change any of your custom, or you don't have to be a bad girl or do any of the things that the social challenge of wearing foreign clothing might represent. So there's sort of this domestication of the threat of foreign clothing that goes on here in Shiseido, an important modernizing company. Some more pictures here of meisen, a cheap silk that is produced in the early 20th century, and a little bit more images of some of the modern girls in this sort of Japanese flapper age. But of course, just jumping through here, this didn't last. Oh, this is a fabulous game. Again, the department stores are very important for giving fashion to the entire family. This is the new game of fashion for the family. It's sort of all the items that different members of the family, right from their grandchildren to the grandparents, might like. This is something we don't often think about. Japan's such a shopping mecca, but once upon a time, shopping was always mediated through a clerk. See in this flyer, for the Mitsukoshi department store, at the bottom, they have the traditional way of shopping. Sitting down, talking to a clerk, telling them what you want, they're going to go away and find something and bring it back to see if you like it. In 1880, Mitsukoshi brought in glass display cases and allowed people to sort of walk through the shops and look and touch and have the sort of shopping experience that we just take for granted today. But this was a really new thing. So new, in fact, they did a little promotional print about it in 1880. Here again, you see that same logo, the Mitsukoshi department store. This is from Hiroshige in 1856. So I'm jumping through to the Showa period, of course, because the descent into fascism that happened in the 1930s suddenly turned fashion away from this modernizing Taishō period, and they had this slogan, "Luxury is our enemy." And again, it turned away from a fashionable culture to a culture that was going to have to sacrifice everything if they actually wanted to have a chance in the Second World War. But of course, Japan was catastrophically defeated in 1945. And after this, there was this period where everyone felt there needed to be complete social and artistic renewal. I'm showing you here a bit of the Gutai movement, which was again, had this idea of starting from nothing. The culture that we'd had so far had taken us into this terrible destructive war, so we have to try and develop a new culture from scratch. And so some of the art movements of this period, things like Gutai and Monoha, were about starting from zero. Some pop culture from the period, Astro Boy, Atomu, was all about the morality of a child being the only sort of morality you could trust. And for women and for fashion, there was a huge desire to renew as well. And there's this amazing statistic that in 1850, married women devoted about 2 hours of every day to needlework. And by 1860, this is the really amazing thing, they had a sewing machine distribution rate of 72%. So 72% of households had a sewing machine. No other nation in the world even came close. So it really was women that went out after the war that wanted to gain new skills, but also wanted to have new fashions and culturally renew. And of course, this led to the economic miracle, or was one of the things that led to the economic miracle throughout the 60s and 70s that saw Japan, as well as heavily industrialize again, and famously have a export based economy, but there was also vast consumption internally, and a new fashion culture sprang up after the war as well. Of course, it was contested, and I'm showing you here Kusama Yayoi and some of her sort of art. Again, this idea of wanting to start from zero, but she always had this fashion part to her practice. You might have seen some of her paintings and some of her sculptures, but she also always made clothing, often sort of more conceptual art than fashion, I guess. This is the squid dress, the phallic dress, a dress for two people. And I'm showing you these because obviously these are provocations and works of art, but that same way of ignoring the body and creating sculptural forms is something that you start to see in what we call the big three, the famous fashion designers that sprang up in the 1970s in Japan: Rei Kawakubo, Issey Miyake, and Yohji Yamamoto. They're all famous, for this way of wrapping the body in the same way that kimono does. Instead of tailoring to the body and going with the body, as a lot of Western fashion had done until this period, they completely ignore the body or wrap it or create a sculptural form on top of it. And so this was something quite new in global fashion, and they all became very important in the global fashion industry. Showing you here some images of the bubble period, when, of course, the stock market and property bubble got completely out of control. The Imperial Palace was said to be worth more than California. And you start to have sort of a break from reality in fashion, as well as in economics. One of the images, famous images from this period, is Juliana's nightclub, and it was called the bodycon, body conscious fashion. And this was a fashion that required you to sort of be very tall and thin. And if you were sort of long and leggy, you got to dance on the podium there at Juliana's nightclub. But at the same time, because most Japanese women are not tall, you start to see the real growth of a cute aesthetic, an alternate aesthetic that instead of accentuating uh, sexiness and tallness and attenuation, starts to emphasize um, uh, a whole different type of attractiveness. Um, During the bubble period, I love this comparison. Uh, Luxury fashion grew by 272%. Um, and at its peak, the average Japanese person had 1.6 Louis Vuitton items, and 40% of Japanese women owned at least one Louis Vuitton item. And that's super interesting because those little flower designs on every Louis Vuitton purse were actually Japanese. They were actually stolen and culturally appropriated, I guess, by Louis Vuitton at the 1867 World Fair in Paris, where he saw they're actually little Japanese little Japanese family crests. And he put them on his luggage, and all the French thought it was amazingly exotic because it was Japanese. And then 100 years later, uh, all the Japanese love Louis Vuitton because they think it's French. So this wonderful sort of cultural doubling in the Louis Vuitton brand, and perhaps explains partly why it's so popular in Japan. These are some more images from Kawakubo. Just wanted to finish, I know I'm running out of time, a number of theories I have about contemporary Japanese fashion. The first one, and we were talking about this a little bit before, was throughout the Meiji period, when there was sort of foreign clothes and kimono at the same time, they used to say that there was this thing called the double life, that it was you are modern and Western in public, but you were Japanese, wearing kimono, relaxing on tatami in private. And I think this division of the way Japanese people think about fashion still exists today. They can have a very um, divided life. This sort of cosplay they can do on the weekend, but this girl might be an office worker during the week. She has a double life, I'm sure. Another interesting aspect, I think, of Japanese fashion is that there's no concept of new money being nouveau riche. Um, that way in which every Japanese person felt entitled to luxury handbags and Louis Vuitton handbags, and all the schoolgirls have them. There was no way that they ever thought that was something that was um, demonstrating that they were newly rich, the way we might hesitate to show off in that way. I think that comes from the fact that Western fashion arrived so quickly, and throughout the Edo period, the sumptuary laws meant that it was just illegal to try and show off. And so there was no sort of rules or prejudice against luxury expenditure that happened in Europe and America. The other things is that signs often don't mean the same thing. And things like punk or drug culture or anything like that might be just worn as a look rather than actually representing a genuine social challenge or um, or preference of the wearer. And finally, the fashion press. If you've ever opened a Japanese fashion magazine, you'll see that they're incredibly didactic. Every page is covered in information. A friend of mine actually started to work when Vogue Japan started in Japan. And they started thinking that they could be like Vogue America and have these big sort of clear blank pages with just an image that was aspirational. But Japanese people kept complaining. They treat the fashion press as something that they want to get exactly right. They want to imitate a look perfectly rather than just simply be inspired by a concept and maybe by the brand because they were inspired by the concept. That's not the way Japanese use fashion magazines. Anyway, I think I'll stop there and hopefully we can have some questions.
So much for that rapid show of Japanese fashion over centuries. I know that we have a lot to talk to you about in the next 20 minutes, but I think one of the things that makes me very curious about our modern fashion, as you were saying, that it's very instructional. I've noticed that Japanese fashion changes very, very quickly on an annual basis, and everyone's doing it, or at least that's what it feels like when we're on the trains here. Um, so I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on that sort of fast, and then we're doing something else the next year.
I guess the first thing to say is that because living space is so small, particularly in Tokyo, and Japanese people often don't use it socially. They spend most of their time actually in the city. And so Americans and Australians, we use our houses, we entertain in our houses, and we're sort of always doing something to our house. Australians are always building a new kitchen or a new barbecue area or something like that, and so we sort of compete and prioritize that. But Japanese people don't sort of use their houses socially as much, particularly in the big cities. They'll have a tiny space, so they live in the city, and I think this means that you spend a lot more on your fashion because it's more important. You're always out. Um, and you spend less perhaps on your house on refurbishing or furniture or decorating or things like that. So I think that's the sort of first thing to say about the priorities and that comes from sort of domestic space. The other thing is I just think because of that double life and that the culture that has existed since the sort of Meiji period, um, and the way even in that Shiseido article that I showed you, they were telling you, or they were telling the consumer to think of fashion as play and to not take seriously any social message that it might have in its home context. Means that Japanese people do just think of fashion more playfully. It's not a statement of my identity. It's just some fun I'm having. We often think of sort of self-fashioning, that if I'm a punk, I'm going to be a punk 24/7. It's me. I am that. Whereas a Japanese punk is just, oh, I like this aesthetic. I like this look. I'm going to wear it on the weekend and then be something different during the week.
Fascinating. So then we have a question here from Bronwyn Davis. With inflation being a reality in Japan now for the first time in decades, how has this impacted today's fashion?
Gosh, I'm not actually in Japan currently. Um, and we always used to speculate that there would have to be inflation eventually. Just demographically, there was no way you could keep, or the temptation to sort of inflate um, prices would become too great for any government. Um, yeah, I don't really know. I mean, Japan was sort of always a little bit exempt from sort of those uh, social indicators that we always map fashion against the economy with. The people delay their haircut an extra week if in bad economic times, or they stop going to the dry cleaner as their first expense that they save. So fashion is obviously has that status where it's very um, sensitive to economic conditions. Um, but again, it's hard to change an entire culture immediately. So it might be longer before um, you sort of see any real change in the amount of expenditure on fashion in Japan.
Fascinating. So I think one other thing that's maybe related to that is I've definitely seen a lot of ads, and even people are always talking about secondhand clothing. Um, and when I was living in Kyoto, there was a whole market for secondhand kimono, but more in Tokyo, there's a lot more of secondhand fashion. I was wondering if you could comment on that kind of movement of used clothing.
Well, there's always been sort of secondhand market for kimono because there's only a couple of standard sizes, and so anyone can wear anyone else's clothing, basically. And you can sort of adjust with folds or whatever for height. So it is, I think there was a slide that I breezed over about how how actually rational and sensible kimono is as a clothing system, because it is sort of um, so much better for recycling or growing children, or um, and passing down is the other thing. You would always pass down your kimono to your children, um, except your best kimono, which you would donate to a temple um, as a sort of a way of preserving your most beautiful moment. You sort of give it to the gods. Um, that said, there was always, particularly when I lived in Japan, other secondhand clothing was very problematic. Again, sort of Buddhist prohibitions on sort of other people's clothing, or things needing to be new, meant that normally if there was a secondhand market, it had to be luxury goods, and sort of thrifting in the way that we might do in Euro-American countries didn't really exist. And this was a problem too, because people didn't even want to donate their clothes. They thought that was sort of dirty and in some way impure. So I remember when Uniqlo sort of started to encourage people to recycle Uniqlo, and they had these boxes, and it was actually a big deal for people to actually start doing that. Now it seems to be a whole culture has developed in places like Shimokitazawa, where there's always an amazing amount of thrift stores. But that's actually quite a new development, I think, for there to be Yofuku recycling or thrift shops for Western clothes.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. So we have a couple more questions. One is from Karen Vaskruzen. How do young people reconcile their interest in fashion with workplace requirements? Are uniforms being phased out, in particular for women?
Well, I know this is very contentious, and I know there's sort of been a few victories in terms of corporate clothing codes being challenged. Um, I think the real answer, though, is the same as before. It's young people do it through a double life. They're the perfect office girl during the week. On the weekend, there's something completely different. And that's perhaps another really important point that I found culturally fascinating, was the partition of your public life and your private life. I worked with people for more than a decade at the University of Tokyo. Went out with them, went drinking with them, liked them, called them my friends. But if they never mentioned their home life, I would never know if they were married, if they had children. It was always only mentioned if people wanted to mention. So there's this way in which public life and private life can be completely divided, and that also means you can be a different character in your private life and your public life. And I think that's a lot of young people still do that. They still have their that separation.
So one question here is, we've been talking a lot about women, but Gail Elliott asks, I wonder how you would characterize men's fashion and related trends in Japan vis-a-vis women's.
Well, Gil, I don't know if you've ever tried to get near a mirror in a men's bathroom in Tokyo. It's just, you can't. Like, there are all these men sort of doing things to their hair, or like men are just as engaged, I think, with their look and with fashion. Um, uh, so I think menswear was Japanese menswear, I think, is the envy of the world. If you think of the Square Mile in London, or or Fifth Avenue in New York, and you actually go to those places and you get very disappointed because there aren't as many stylish people as you hope to see. But in Tokyo, it sort of never disappoints. There's such a, and again, I think it's just that because you live your whole life in the city, you spend a lot more time on your fashion. And in fashion theory, we call this thing called the Great Masculine Renunciation, which sort of happens after the French Revolution, when men no longer want to look ornamental or beautiful. They just want to look useful, because they don't want to be seen as decadent or aristocratic or anything like that. But that is sort of still a dominant trend in Western menswear, that the burden of display is on women. Of course, it's broken down over the 20th century and into the 21st century, but really for the 250 years since the French Revolution, men have wanted to wear black suits and look useful and serious, and women have had to do all the dressing up, which is, the opposite in nature. Men are always the males of any species other than humans is always the one that has to show off, and the women are always um, less ornamental. But in our species, it tended, for cultural reasons, to be the other way. Japan didn't never have that French Revolution, and so I think there was always a way in which Japanese men have cared just as much about display um, as women have, and that sort of continues, I think, to this day.
Which is extremely fascinating on a how we show ourselves and perceive ourselves. Um, so then we have a question from Claire Hahn. What factors have shaped Japanese fashion into a distinctly Japanese form or Japanese style? Comparing fashion in the Meiji period with contemporary Japan, what's the most significant change? So two questions here from her.
So, I mean, obviously, 250 years of isolation has is still present, that's and the fact that there's never been any sort of serious immigration or um, into Japan means that there's sort of this sort of Galapagos idea that Japan's evolving separately from the rest of the world, and it's a little bit cut off and does its own thing, evolves differently. Um, and on top of that, sort of the history of incredible ups and downs uh, over the last 150 years of uh, a feudal country that became an imperial power, that then suffered nuclear defeat, that then had an economic miracle, that then had a bubble, and then so it's also this incredible history of resilience and renewal um, that I think, and always in the presence of some monolithic other. Even the presence of America as the sort of as the superpower, or the culturally as well as militarily and economically, that has also shaped it too. And I think uh, that desire to be something special and distinct is also part of that formulation. The Meiji period to contemporary Japan, what's the most significant change? Well, the politicians still get photographed in top hats and tailcoats. So that's something that has never changed, the sort of the way in which no other country in the world maintains tailcoats, except if you go to meet the emperor or if you get elected to the diet. There are things that haven't changed. Obviously, the pendulum of the embrace of the kimono, particularly by women, has swung back and forth. In the early Meiji period, there's a big swing towards bustle dresses and things like that. And then various waves of nationalism brought the kimono back into style. And then through the 1920s, there was a real embrace of Western fashion. And then the war emphasized nationalism again, and women returned to kimono and monpe and other things like that. And then again, so I think it hasn't just been one big change, it's been a pendulum that's swinging back and forth between the Meiji period and contemporary Japan. I think always, though, that Japan is very open to being experimental then and now. We often used to say there's very little fashion violence in Japan. Like, no one stares at you or teases you if you're wearing something different or crazy or trying something new. You're always sort of um, accepted, and I think that's another very interesting part of the culture.
So one of the things that we were sort of talking about before this webinar started was with that whole pendulum of kimono use. What you're seeing a lot now is a lot of foreigners getting into the art of kimono collecting, of kimono wearing, going to kimono classes, doing tea ceremony. What do you think the role of, especially foreigners in Japan, engaging in kimono has in terms of that sort of pendulum trend you were speaking of?
Um, I think it's super interesting that Japan never cares, right? Uh, I remember there was that scandal, I think it was the Boston Institute of Fine Arts, where there's a Monet painting of his wife in a kimono, and people could pay to dress up in a kimono and get photographed in front of it. And there was this, sort of a scandal where everyone said, oh, cultural appropriation, oh, it's terrible. Except Japanese people didn't seem to care at all. It just seemed to be a reflex that people had that you couldn't, or that it was some way disrespectful to engage with someone else's or to dress up in someone else's culture. But Japan has never um, had any insecurities about sharing its kimono culture, and that's a really interesting and different to a number of other cultures. Um, I think that Japan has always, and was one of the first cultures to sort of negotiate the preservation of its tradition in modernity. And it did so really, really well. We still have a kimono culture today, even though Japan is one of the most modern uh, countries on earth. Um, uh, so foreigners wearing kimono, I think Japanese people love that because it preserves kimono as a culture. Um, there was a time in sort of the 1980s and 1990s during the bubble where kimono became something that was almost exclusively luxurious. You would buy a kimono for your wedding, and it would be, $5,000, $10,000. But fortunately, sort of since then, there's sort of been a renaissance, and I think part of it because of foreign interest, um, in sort of a more everyday kimono, a more sort of use of the culture of the clothing at different levels of formality, not just at sort of the most formal.
Well, thank you so much for that. It'll be interesting to see where that goes in the future. So, again, thank you so much for your presentation. We have run out of time, but as if folks haven't been looking at the chat, we've shared some links to both of Toby's books if you want to learn more about this. So, once again, thank you, Toby, and thank you everyone else who joined us today for this great conversation.
FadTech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.